I'm delighted to be able to introduce Chris Murphy. I ran in '08. You will remember that. And when I ran in '08, I was running against the last Republican in New England, Chris Shays. And boy, do we miss the Chris Shays version of the Republican Party today. But it was a long shot. I hadn't been in politics. And honestly, early on in that campaign, I met Chris, who had done something remarkable in his district in 2006, and Joe Courtney. But I mean, from that moment on, Chris helped me, first of all, figure out how to do this job, how to campaign, some of the advice that he gave me in those early years. You'd laugh if you heard it because I was sort of such a babe in the woods, but really was an enormously close friend. And I just say was because as happy as I am that he's a United States Senator today, we really miss him in the House. And you know Chris Murphy because you read about what he does in general, but you also read about his leading on the thoughtfulness and creation of a progressive foreign policy, which is not a dovish foreign policy necessarily. It's a smart foreign policy that reflects our values. And obviously, coming off the last 4 years that we've been coming off, what Chris has been thinking about and writing and talking about is, in fact, how we restore this country, certainly abroad, to the values that we all care so deeply about. So I thank you for the opportunity, the surprising opportunity to introduce my great friend and the senator from Connecticut, Chris Murphy.
All right, that was all right. That counts. Thanks, Jim. Great to see everyone. Chris, thanks so much for inviting me on. And I got to catch the end of Jim's remarks on cybersecurity. To repay the compliment, I always sort of described Jim during my time with him in the House as one of those handful of people whose name up on the big board was sort of occupying a prominent place on these tough votes, especially when you have a sort of string of them on a major appropriations bill. Often you'll come onto the floor, with equities on both sides. And for me, but for a lot of other people, Jim, when I served in the House, was one of those people where you wanted to know where he was. You wanted to know sort of how he had analyzed a particular thorny issue, and particularly increasingly in this national security space. Jim's nice to say good things about the work I've done on progressive foreign policy, and I think that's what I'm going to talk about here. He really is become one of the go-to folks on understanding the really kind of difficult interaction between sort of overt foreign policy and covert foreign policy, and understanding the right ways to engage in surveillance, the right way to engage in counterterrorism operations while not obliterating First Amendment rights, and frankly, not doing more damage to American reputation abroad through a lot of the things that we do that don't end up in the headlines. And so we're partners on this national security reform work, but as you mentioned, we're also just great friends. So a tough act to follow, and really grateful to the Quiet Corner Dems and to all of the individual leaders on this call for all the fantastic support you've given me. Obviously, when I was running for Senate, applying to represent the whole state, none of you really knew me. And the fact that you invited me up over and over and took the opportunity to open your door to me is something that I'll be eternally grateful for. And so many of the folks on this call now are great allies. I'm going to be pretty quick in my remarks. I do think I was asked to talk a little bit about the state of American foreign policy, and I'll maybe give a sort of 60,000 foot view and then let the questions guide us to specific hotspots and crises around the world. And given what's happened in Israel and the Palestinian territories over the course of the last week, no shortage of topical issues to cover. But I'll maybe take the invitation from Jim, who talked about the work that I and a handful of others have done to try to articulate what a progressive foreign policy is. This is a term of art that's relatively new, and I think is an incredibly useful way to talk about foreign policy today, because Joe Biden himself actually has talked about a foreign policy for the middle class. And that's kind of a hard thing to understand, because we've never really tried to, as Democrats, tie our conversation about our role in the world to the protection of sort of the values that undergird our domestic policy. But I think it's important to do that. To me, a progressive foreign policy, first and foremost, acknowledges that there's almost no domestic progressive priority that doesn't have a foreign policy complement to it. If you care about climate change, well, yeah, the United States is 25% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions, but 75% of those emissions come from other places. And if the United States isn't engaged in a global conversation about climate, then no matter what we do here, we're not going to be able to save the planet for our kids. If you care about the health of our democracy, let me tell you, the technologies and the practices that are undermining democracies are being midwifed and perfected outside of the United States. And if you don't sort of build up and protect the fragile democracies that Russia and China are trying to undermine all around their spheres, then those techniques will be successfully utilized by a would-be autocrat here in the United States. And by the way, those countries, in fact, are actively trying to destroy our democracy. And we can talk, you all know the ways in which the Russians do it on a regular basis, but other adversaries are trying as well. So if we're not sort of standing up to protect democracies globally, then we are leaving ourselves vulnerable to attack. Listen, if you care about wages, and we do as progressives, the fact that they have been largely flat, well, there's domestic policy that affects that, no doubt. But if you don't engage in a global conversation about how good paying jobs have been shed in the United States because we've signed trade agreements overseas that have sort of allowed for countries to dramatically undercut us on labor standards and environmental standards, well, then there's a limit to what you can do domestically. So I just think that we have no choice as progressives but to be engaged in the world. And, there are some that have, I think, a very valid critique of what they see as an imperialistic America that's involved in all sorts of places overseas that we have no business. I largely view this as a question of how we're engaged, not whether we should or should not be engaged. And so that's why the second part, to my mind, of a sort of conversation on progressive foreign policy is about the tools that we use. Listen, a reporter was asking me the other day, why I sort of have cared for so long about the war in Yemen, given the fact that, to many Americans, it doesn't seem to have much to do with the U.S. national security interests. And I would argue that it does. And there's some pretty terrible terrorist groups there that are designing to attack the United States that are getting stronger as the civil war persists. But really, to me, it was an example of how our Middle East hubris, something that we should have shed after the Iraq War, was still dominating our foreign policy decision-making. We thought that the US military, in this case in combination with the Saudi military, could somehow render political change on the ground in a far-off country, in this case, Yemen. That has almost never been the case. And every time that we try to send troops abroad to solve what are inherently political problems, we almost universally fail. And yet, as you know, the old adage, if all you have is a hammer, then everything looks like a nail to you. So when you have more members of military bands than you have the total number of diplomats in the State Department, everything's going to look like it has a military solution. And so what I'm arguing for is a dramatic increase in the amount of money that we put into the State Department and USAID so that we can, actually be engaged in the world in a way that isn't just the projection of military power. That has failed over the years. But I don't think the United States is destined to fail around the world if we engage in a different way. I give you, Yemen is an example. Yemen was a very, very flawed democracy about 10 to 15 years ago, but they had elections. They were a very poor and very corrupt democracy, but a democracy nonetheless. And instead of investing in that country, instead of putting significant money to support democracy, fight corruption, try to do economic development deals, we ultimately just approached it through a military prism. And when the country devolved into civil war, we did what we know how to do, which is just throw a bunch of military assets on one side. That was a country which maybe never would have found its way into a civil war had the United States been a better democracy and economic partner. But we can't even imagine those kind of solutions because we don't have anywhere near the resources to try to affect policy in other parts of the world in a non-military way. Listen, there are limits to the influence of American power. We shouldn't believe that any specific tool, whether it be non-military or military, is going to be able to solve every problem. But my argument is that we should be engaged. We should dramatically reorient the way in which we engage away from the Department of Defense into state and energy and USAID. And we should learn from the mistakes of the past. And so that's the case that I'm trying to make as a member of the Foreign Relations Committee. And listen, I think if we have smarter trade policy in which we have trade agreements that are based upon what's good for workers instead of what's good for corporations, if we're fighting for democracies abroad and fighting back against the enemies of democracy, that helps our fight to protect our own democracy. And if we're leading with diplomacy, right, if we scale up our diplomatic efforts around the world, then we can lead a conversation around climate change. We can fight back against the Chinese's efforts to try to dumb down everything from financial standards to food safety standards to product safety standards. We can win some of these fights, but it's not done through withdrawal of American influence. It's done through the transformation of American influence. So, that's the sort of prism through which I'd like to have our conversation today. I think it's an exciting time to be involved in foreign policy. The Biden administration and I are going to have places where we don't agree, and I'll be happy to share those with you today, or what I think they may be. There'll be other places in which we'll be very much aligned, but that was also the case during the Obama administration. I lined up with President Obama on things like the Iran nuclear deal. I fought him hard on things like military intervention in Syria and the Yemen military campaign. So I expect the same will be true of my relationship with the Biden team. But I feel super grateful to be in a position to be influential, to have been sent to the Senate twice by the people of Connecticut. Obviously, I still spend the bulk of my time on domestic policy, whether it be healthcare or guns or infrastructure. But I, do think that, you have an obligation in this job to, look out for America's security and to, make sure that we're making things better, not worse, around the world. And that has not always been the case throughout my time in public service. And so I feel like the work I do in the Foreign Relations Committee is important, and I think ultimately translates pretty directly to the prosperity of people in Connecticut. So again, thanks for having me on. I apologize. There'll be a bunch of commotion. I have a small house with a bunch of people in it today. So you'll hear a couple of kids and friends running around as I chat, but I figured I'd let you kind of guide a tour around the world, and we can talk about U.S. policy in various places.
Thank you, Senator. The first question I have for you is, could you give a thumbnail sketch of what's going on in Colombia, and why hasn't the U.S. taken a more visible role protecting Colombians and democracy there, and where do you see it heading?
Yeah, I had a long conversation with our incoming Assistant Secretary for the Western Hemisphere, Brian Nichols, 2 days ago on Colombia. He and I met privately. He will likely be confirmed soon. So we have a lot of work to do there. Colombia's problems are in part self-inflicted by a right-wing government that has not implemented the peace agreement with the FARC, has not lived up to its end of the bargain, has unfortunately clamped down on political dissent and press freedom. Part of Colombia's problems come from the outside. The instability in Venezuela has bled over into Colombia. They have, I don't know what the current number is, tens of thousands maybe hundreds of thousands of Venezuelan refugees that are putting a strain on a difficult economy. And the latest round of protests were set off by some economic changes proposed by the Colombian government. While they have sort of pulled back those proposals, admittedly, some of their economic reform measures have been sort of pushed by the world community that's trying to sort of get their budget back in line. One of the things that I raised for the incoming assistant secretary is that the crackdown on these protests is being undertaken by security units financed by the United States. And so we need to understand that we own responsibility for the way in which the security services have interacted with what often have been peaceful protesters. And so we talked about ways that the administration, once they get fully staffed up, can try to exert some influence on the tactics that are being used and to try to put some pressure on this government in particular to implement reform and to move forward with the peace proposal. So, listen, the Duque government's a conservative government. They are going to not always align with U.S. requests. There, we have been partners with them on Plan Colombia and on trying to tackle the issues coming out of Venezuela, but we can draw a much harder line with them, given the significant amount of U.S. security aid that still flows into that country.
Thank you, sir. So we'll get to a really specific question. Will President Biden be able to finally close Guantanamo? What do we need to do to get to that point?
I mean, it doesn't feel like it's a priority for him in the way that it was for President Obama. President Obama, every year announced his plans to close Guantanamo, and every year Congress would attach a rider to the appropriations bill, riders that I voted against, that would require Guantanamo to stay open. And so Obama was not able to do it. Interestingly, back to Yemen, a lot of the individuals inside Guantanamo historically have been Yemeni Americans picked up in our fight against AQIP. Many of them are Afghans. I don't know the answer to that question. I have not actually heard from the Biden administration on their plans. I get the sense, as I said, that they aren't as focused on this as the Obama administration is. I don't know if the coalition still remains in Congress to sort of attach that rider year after year, because it's a very different Congress than it was in 2009 and 2010. But I have been a long-standing proponent of closing down that facility and making decisions. I mean, listen, we're talking about people who've been there now for decades. You either try them in a domestic court or you admit that you don't have a case against them and release them. We have to sort of understand right now that all of our enemies and adversaries, whether they be non-state actors or state actors, are very successful in using American hypocrisy against us. And this, over the years, has been a bulletin board item for those organizations and adversaries. The idea that we say we stand for the rule of law, and yet we have a largely secret prison in which we hold people without charges for years and years at a time. There's no doubt that our domestic system, whether it be a military court or a civilian court, can handle these individuals' cases. So I don't know. It's a reminder for me there's so many other things that we've been dealing with the Biden administration on. I have not heard from them on this topic, but it's a good reminder to check in.
Cool. I'm going to put several questions together and just ask, what should we be doing in Israel? What's the answer? Fix it in 2 minutes.
Well, I mean, listen, what happened over the last 2 weeks is, absolutely heartbreaking. I was one of the first to start putting pressure on both Israel to announce a ceasefire, but also to get our administration more locked in on achieving that result. I can certainly talk about the sort of proximate cause of the unrest, which was the attempted eviction of these Palestinians from Sheikh Jarrah. In my mind, there's no justification for the continued displacement of Palestinians in East Jerusalem neighborhoods. It is simply a tactic to try to make a Palestinian state impossible and to take from them the ability to ever sort of use East Jerusalem as a capital for that state. The overly securitized response to Al-Aqsa Mosque also lit this fuse. All that being said, there's no justification for what Hamas did. There's no justification for Hamas deciding to indiscriminately send rockets into Israel with the intention of killing as many civilians as possible. And so Hamas deserves to be called out for war crimes and to take a large share of the blame for what happened over the last week and a half. That being said, the last incursion into Gaza lasted about 50 days. This one lasted less than 2 weeks. Obviously, that's no comfort to the hundreds of families, mostly in Gaza, a handful in Israel who've lost loved ones during this conflict. I do think it speaks to, the success of the Biden administration in pursuing diplomacy that was quiet, and maybe that was frustrating to people, but in the end, arguably more successful than the diplomacy we engaged in 2014. Now comes the hard part. We still talk about a Palestinian state here in the United States. They don't talk about it much in Israel or the Palestinian territories any longer, because the moves that Netanyahu made over the course of the Trump administration have made a viable Palestinian state almost impossible. And it's that sense of hopelessness that's crept into the Palestinian territories that is real, and that is going to be the seeds of unrest for a long time coming. So our policy is going to have to be designed towards trying to reverse course, trying to find a pathway back to a two-state future. Obviously, Netanyahu's politics do not involve a Palestinian state, but we're going to have to draw a harder line with the Israelis. And I haven't yet gotten into a conversation about exactly what that looks like, but it's not good for us. It's not good for Israel in the long run if their decision is effectively between apartheid or a state that is not Jewish. That's effectively the choice they have if they're not going to engage in a conversation about two states. So Biden administration has a lot of work to do. I mean, I don't think that they were planning on investing a lot of capital on this question. I think they wanted to, in general, sort of reorient focus away from the Middle East and towards Africa and the Western Hemisphere and Asia. I don't think they have that luxury. I think they're going to have to press, and they're going to have to be an interlocutor as we have in the past there. And they will obviously have a lot of folks like me who are going to be sort of speaking up for, a more forceful pursuit of a two-state path there in the coming months and next couple of years of the early Biden administration.
Excellent, thank you. Now, probably an easier question. Do you know what proportion of ambassador appointments are still pending, and are they continuing with this donor to ambassador habit of the past?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think all of them are pending. I'm not sure. I'm trying to think what ambassador posts we have named already, maybe a handful, but almost all of the decisions have been made. But for instance, we don't have, ambassadors to our main European ally countries. We don't have an ambassador to Israel, Saudi Arabia, Japan. There's speculation as to who those are going to be. but we don't have them named yet. So here's my thought on this question, because it's a really important one. I don't love the donor to ambassador pipeline. At the same time, I think that there should be room to have close political allies of the president be named as ambassadors to key countries. I don't think that you should only appoint career foreign service individuals to these posts. And that sometimes is a difficult sort of line to draw, right? When are you just a donor and getting access to an ambassadorial post because of the donations you've raised? When are you a key political ally of the president? Often those two are the same. But some of our most effective ambassadors over the years have actually been people who, were political allies of the president. I'll give you an example. John Emerson was our ambassador to Germany during much of the Obama administration. John has worked in government before. He's worked at the White House. He's a public official, but he did raise money he was in the private sector during Obama's campaign, and he did raise money for Barack Obama. And so was he a donor? Was he a sort of experienced public servant and political ally of the president? Not clear, but he was a really good ambassador to Germany. What I think is probably important is to put a cap on the number of non-career foreign service officers that get these jobs. And there's another reason for that, which is that you want to make sure that career foreign service officers have the opportunity for advancement. They don't feel capped out. They don't feel that they sort of get to the point where they're second in charge at an embassy, and then there's so few ambassadorships that go to anybody other than the political allies of the president that they don't have a path to the top job. So I think you should probably limit the number of political ambassadors, but I wouldn't argue for eliminating them. I would just, counsel the president to use some discretion in how he hands those out and how he makes those decisions. And my sense is that Biden is going to do that. My sense is that Biden has bought this argument of being much more careful about, just placing donors into these jobs. But we'll see. Very few of them have been announced.
Excellent. So, can you name an issue or two in the world of international relationships that deserves more attention than it's getting from the media or from the American public?
Yeah. I mean, I guess, I get incredibly frustrated at the lack of attention to our own hemisphere. It used to be that if you were a member of Congress, you had to have an expertise in U.S.-Mexico relations, Central America, South America. There were I was talking to a couple experts on the Northern Triangle a few weeks ago, and they were saying, back in the 80s and 90s, there were congressional delegations going down to these countries all the time. It was just, it was part of your responsibility to, for members of Congress to maintain relations with its own hemisphere. We have abdicated that responsibility. We've shifted all of our focus to the Middle East. We have become, for some reasons, rightly obsessive about China and Russia in the past decade, that we've, forgotten our own backyard, often some of our most important trading partners. I've spoken at length to Vice President Harris, who's a friend, about her role as the convener of policy on the Northern Triangle. I mean, if you care about stemming undocumented migration to this country, well, then let's help fix what's sort of fundamentally broken in places like Guatemala and El Salvador, other countries throughout Central and South America. That helps us in the United States. Let's end this just nonsense policy towards Cuba, in which we think that ignoring them and blockading them is going to change their politics. Let's try not to turn Venezuela into the next Cuba. We can do a lot more in our own hemisphere, get a lot of economic bang for the buck, because they are all very important trading partners. We can address the migration issues. So that's my hope, is that, over the next couple of years, we can spend some more time thinking about our own backyard, and I intend to try to try to play a role in that conversation. So I'll give you that as one example. I've got a million other places around the world where I think we should be paying closer attention to, but that's certainly one of them.
And the last question I've got in is actually from State Representative Mike Winkler. And judging from your last answer, the answer is probably yes. But do you think U.S. financial aid to some South American nations should increase?
I do, and I think we have to think, really carefully about how we're going to use it. The State Department just announced, for instance, yesterday that we would no longer be sending our aid in El Salvador to the government. The government has taken a very dangerous turn towards autocracy there, essentially suspending the independence of the judiciary in the past several weeks. And we're going to instead send our money in El Salvador to civil society. We're going to send it to pro-democracy and pro sort of rule of law reform groups. I think we will have to do much of that throughout the region, spend money not on corrupt governments, but on the folks that are actually trying to fight for reforms. So, and that involves an increase. The amount of money that we spend on foreign aid, of course, people think that it's these fascinating studies in which people have asked, what percentage of the federal budget do you think is being spent on foreign aid? And then what percentage of the federal budget do you think should be spent on foreign aid? And I don't have the numbers off the top of my head, but people think that we're spending 100 times as much as we are. But then when you ask them how much we should spend, they think that we should spend 20 times as much as we are today. And so people are much more willing to be involved in the world under the right circumstances than we give them credit for. So I put out a big blueprint about a year ago, arguing to double the size of the State Department USAID in an effort to try to bite off a piece of that. I got together with Chris Van Hollen, Senator from Maryland, and two members of the House of Representatives, and we put on the table a detailed plan to increase those budgets by 20% this coming year. Biden proposed a 10% increase, so we're heading in the right direction here. But by the way, we haven't even talked about global public health here, which we should have. When we think about all the money we need to be spending overseas, a lot of it right now has to be on tracking pandemic diseases, helping rebuild public health infrastructure in Africa, in Asia, but also in our own hemisphere. What America has seen in the last year is that this ratio of spending on the Department of Defense to global public health clearly isn't working. And so that's going to have to be a big part of our partnership, both in our own hemisphere and around the world.
Well, thank you so much, Senator. Appreciate you taking a time out of your Saturday to speak with us. And again, we're proud to have you as our senator.
Well, again, let me just congratulate you on all of your local successes. Ask that you involve me and my team in all of the different local races that you'll be undertaking between now and November. Obviously, we sort of hope to be in a little bit more normal of a campaign environment. I still have and fund Fight Back Connecticut, which was sort of the big organization that I put together in 2018 to help us in the midterms, have kept it together, a little bit smaller scale, but I've still got great folks there with great expertise to help us on our joint projects. So let's keep in touch, and I'm really grateful for the chance to join you for a little while today.